welcome everybody to the CT&S Forum. If you don't know me, I'm Ted Peters. I may look like Bob Russell, but I'm not Bob Russell. Bob, unfortunately, is not feeling well this evening, and so he's staying home and taking care of Maya the dog. But we have Charlotte Russell here with us to represent the Russell family, and our guest, Adam Pryor, is the Russell Family Fellow for this spring in 2020. And Bob wanted to be here to introduce Adam. He's not here, but I'm going to read Bob's introduction. We all liked Adam here, but he grew up and he moved away. So it's now nice to have Adam back. And we have a program here tonight, the lecture or the forum. Then Saturday we have a research conference, which is normally part of the Russell Fellowship, in which we take a scholarly paper and then we knock heads over this for a few hours. So if you'd like to do that on Saturday, all you need to do is see Melissa, who's sitting back there, and she'll sign you up. So let me introduce Adam Pryor. Adam Pryor is Associate Professor of Religion and Dean of Academic Affairs for Student Success at Bethany College. Is there any non-success tracks there?
There are plenty of non-success tracks there. Many of them go through my other classes.
Adam's research is focused on religion and science, phenomenology, queer studies, and the work of Paul Tillich. He is the author or editor of a number of books. The most recent is titled Living with Tiny Aliens, and there's a flyer for Living with Tiny Aliens, which is coming out with Fordham University Press in late spring. Adam entered the GTU in 2008 with an undergraduate summa cum laude in theology and philosophy and a minor in sacred music and an MDiv at Princeton Seminary. I think I've heard of that before. The East Coast, is it somewhere? Yeah. Or they have bad weather.
It's where you go if you don't get into GTU.
Oh, okay. At the GTU, he took graduate UCB courses with anthropologist Terry Deacon and paleoanthropologist Margaret Conkey. In 2009, Adam was Bob's teaching assistant for a course called Introduction to Christian Theology and Science. Adam then received a coveted Newhall Award from the GTU to work with Bob in creating a body of introductory materials in theology and science, which CT&S used and what evidently you and Bob used when you taught the course in 2011. In his dissertation, it's always nice to know that a GTU doctoral student can get done with the program and can graduate. See, so one way you got something to look forward to. In his dissertation, Adam focused on theological discourse about the living God, where Adam theologically reimagined the religious symbol of the living God by taking seriously scientific and philosophical writing about the emergence of life from non-living substances. See, we're going to get to talk about that tonight.
Wow.
Maybe. After joining the faculty at Bethany College in 2013, Adam produced an astonishing stream of excellent publications, and he is amazing at his research, at his publication, and I don't know if you were trained well or maybe you were a genius when you were born, I'm not sure. Be that as it may, Adam has proved to be a very fine scholar. Adam published his dissertation. The title of that book is The God Who Lives in 2014. Now he's published a remarkable essay, which I've not read, and I don't even know how to pronounce it. Which autogen? Whose incompleteness, considering the ontological conditions of teleodynamics and strong emergence? Boy.
I haven't gotten any better at titling.
Last year, Adam was a resident member at the Center of Theological Inquiry's investigation on the societal implications of astrobiology, sponsored by NASA and the John Templeton Foundation. That was an elite group of scholars getting introduced to astrobiology and then drawing out religious and social impact considerations. Bob is particularly eager to read Adam's latest book. I already read it. I'm ahead of Bob. On a personal note, and now I'm going to read from Bob in the first person. I richly enjoy Adam as a wonderful, thoughtful, and gracious dialogue partner. He is steeped in the Christian tradition and its fully ecumenical context, and he brings to this a knowledge and experience of Christian life rare for its depth and integrity. It is always a pleasure to work with Adam, to experience his enthusiasm, humor, and generous spirit. So, tonight, Adam's presentation is Playful Encounters of the Third Kind, How Science and Religion Dialogue Intersects with Interfaith Advocacy. So, with pleasure, let me present our guest, Adam Pryor.
Well, Bob is a great liar. That is what I learned in being here, because he writes these wonderful, wonderful introductions for people, and now I'm convinced they're all not true, if they sound like this one about me. I was really delighted and honored and shocked, frankly, that Bob asked me to come out to be the Russell Family Lecturer for this year. I remember being a graduate student here and coming to these lectures feeling like they were amazing, wonderful people who were well beyond anything that I could possibly be. So expectations should be lowered for this particular year. And I cherished that time to sit and be with those folks when they were here. They were generous teachers. And as I was getting ready for tonight, Bob assured me that I was not misremembering that oftentimes the Thursday evening talks are a little more personal than a sort of standard academic talk. So I will not try to bore you with personal anecdotes for the entire time. But the topic for me comes from a very personal place. My first position was at Bethany College in Lindsborg, Kansas. And for the better part of a decade before I went out to Lindsborg, I had lived in places like, I lived within an hour of places like New York or San Francisco or Philadelphia. And I went out to this place in Kansas pretty well convinced that all that needed to happen was that as an eager grad student, I could show them my dissertation. They would be so wowed and amazed by the work that I had done that they would adopt the gospel of science and theology work, and Central Kansas would become a new place producing amazing scholars in religion and science. They just needed me to help them see the scales fall from their eyes. And we are all wrong sometimes. And it was a good and humbling lesson, because in my time there, a grand total of 2 students have asked me to teach courses on religion and science. One of them wanted me to teach on philosophy of science, but would tolerate the religion piece if I would go ahead and do the course. It was, as a new professor, somewhat devastating. I spent a lot of time working on these topics. I thought that they were really, really important, so I thought, I know what I will do. I will sneak this into my introductory courses, and consistently for 2 years, the theology and science portion was the lowest rated part of the course on my course evaluations. But as I was teaching those course evaluations, right, after having come out of these large places that I had been living, I was getting a set of questions. And I was getting some of the same questions over and over. So I went back, good, administrator now. I still have all those course evaluations to remind me of how bad it was when I started. And I went and I pulled back the questions that I was actually getting from students during those first 2 years when I was there, right? So these are actual things that students wrote to me after taking a class. Please don't judge my teaching ability on these questions. Okay, so is it okay to ask my Muslim roommate if he's going to heaven? Why do some of the Christian kids cross themselves in chapel and others don't? If I start meditating, does that make me a Buddhist? You keep saying that we shouldn't serve bacon double cheeseburgers if we have Jewish people to dinner. Why, and do I have the same God as they do? It was interesting for me, right? Because in hindsight, I shouldn't have really been surprised by these sorts of questions. But having been in this major urban areas, that sort of religious diversity felt old hat to me. Everybody knew somebody Buddhist. Everybody had gone to synagogue. It just was part of what you did. And my experience was always also that if you were really respectful, that generally people were happy to talk to you about their religious tradition and share things that you wanted to know, or things that you really didn't want to know were going to be shared anyway. But Lindsborg is a town of just under 3,500 people. Wow. Right? The student body is surprisingly diverse, right? But when you live in a town that small, many of the students are coming there because they've come from towns in western Kansas that are even smaller. Okay? So this was the big city that they were going to. It was not uncommon in the courses that I taught that students would come in and say, I've never met a person who was not Christian. When I asked them to talk about what interfaith dialogue looked like, they would quite genuinely ask, you mean when Protestants and Catholics get together and talk? So when I asked students from larger communities, right, it's a pretty diverse place actually, folks who were coming from the West Coast, Dallas, major urban areas, where they had at least experienced some religious diversity, I got statements like this, we don't talk about religion, that's just not okay, people might get mad. And again, for a campus, right, an ELCA college campus, a school affiliated with the Lutheran Church in America, over a third of students choose under demographic information no religious affiliation. So it shouldn't have been real surprising to me that these were the sorts of questions that I was getting. Questions about the nature of lived expressions of religious diversity. Now, it's not as though these sorts of problems disappear when you leave college. And I remain convinced that it's the sort of interdisciplinary teaching that a place like GTU does, that I was trained in, that a place like Bethany is committed to doing, that is absolutely necessary. It's the work that goes on in theology and science or in interfaith studies, and it's particularly necessary in my neck of the woods. If you know anything about Kansas politics, I'm sorry, but also you probably learned it from a book written in 2007 by Adam Frank called What's the Matter with Kansas? Frank looks at how the Great Backlash worked across the Great Plains, causing many voters to vote for specific social cultural values, and those are overwhelmingly framed in religious terms, even at their own economic expense. The argument he puts forward is one that I see playing out with my neighbors all the time over the past 7 years that I've been there, and it's only expanded in significance in the 13 years since his book came out. Whether you think about issues related to healthcare, whether you're thinking about issues that are related to equipping college-educated to healthcare, to climate change, or to the constitutional redefinition of rights, right? I think what you are seeing, and what I would contend, is that the sort of teaching that you do in an interdisciplinary setting in religion and science or in interfaith studies is there to equip college-educated persons to both engage in and lead conversations that integrate religious values across pluralistic perspectives and in harmony with scientific discovery. If you do that, I think that's an essentially necessary political and civic good. So when I talk about or think about the work that religion and science does, for me, it is an effort to resist deeply harmful social policy being put in place by supposedly obvious trans-religious values. That is maybe not the way we usually talk about religion and science, but I think it's deeply integrated into the teaching that really I learned while I was here at the GTU. So, as I think about theology and science and interfaith, and I was confronting these sorts of issues, I finally decided to sort of take a plunge. And I said that I would do some teaching on interfaith works in a general world religions course, and I just sort of repurposed it for this issue, because the nice part about being at a small campus is nobody really questions when I do things like that. And it's great. But there were some challenges there. One, this is not my field of study. I was really well prepared to talk about autocells and small biochemical systems and their effects on things like the living God. I did not necessarily feel equipped in terms of how to lead students in having an interfaith dialogue. Just not my thing. And two, the way that I had learned about doing interfaith work was by, doing it. By sitting around a table with folks who were of a different religious tradition from me. The challenge to that in Lindsborg was that the closest non-Christian religious community was about 90 miles away. And while I was told that I could sort of do whatever I wanted in this course, it was also made very clear to me that it should not cost the college any extra money. So I needed to figure out a way to foster that sort of religious diversity and dynamic. So I started looking to my own students, and much to my not particular surprise, I found at the time that there were really only 2 students on the campus who identified with a non-Christian tradition. It seemed a little rough to bring them in as our only representatives. So I resisted that temptation, but the result was when I went out afterward, I said, other people must have this problem. Let me see how other people do this. All the usual tactics that I could find said, you put people in a conversation around a table and then you let them discover what interfaith dialogue looks like. And I was growing very, very frustrated. And it's around that point that I said, well, I'm going to do a little experiment, because as a science and theology student, I became very comfortable with just co-opting language from science, even though I had no degree in it. And I decided that what I would do is use some very well-trod language in religion and science to see if I could make a way to help students think about interfaith dialogue through that. So that was what I tried right out of the gate, and you can see it right there. I used Ian Barber's typology, which, if you do theology and science here and you don't know Ian Barber's typology, don't tell Bob you don't know. This is the way that I usually teach it. So the little light pink circle is conflict, where the science and religion overlap with each other because they're talking about things but they don't actually fit together real well. Then you have independence, a nice white and darker pink circle, but they don't touch. They do their own thing. Keep them separate. It's usually a joke that the students don't get either. Right? Then there's the sort of Venn diagram version of dialogue, where there are areas of overlapping domain between religion and science, but they are also distinct fields, and so there are areas in each that also don't actually intersect. And then last but not least, integration, which I describe as the Christmas tree model. So you have the metaphysical tree on which you are hanging the ornaments from the different theological or scientific traditions that you're putting in conversation. And depending on which metaphysical tree you pick, your Christmas tree can look quite different. Making a palm tree with wood art is a little tricky. Usually I draw on a board. This is pretty familiar territory, and my thought was, if it works pretty well for theology and science, 2 fields that ostensibly are quite different from each other, how well would it work for 2 religious traditions that are ostensibly different from each other? Would this give students a framework that they could use? And it failed pretty miserably right out of the gate. This is a story of failure. This is also what I learned from Bob. Science is predicated on failure, so this gave me moral courage to keep going. And the problem was not so much that they didn't understand what was going on. They had no idea why it was that they were getting this model or talking about this. They couldn't relate things together. And why was I asking them to do this? I was fairly frustrated, but luckily my office is next door to the theater professor on campus, who is a great person for when you're feeling down to just drive you down a little further. And so he popped his head in my door and he said, I don't know what's going wrong. He said, well, I know what's going wrong. You need to teach them to act. And I said, you've got to be kidding me. He said, no. He said, you know, they don't know how to talk to each other. So teach them to act first, and then I bet they'll do it. And I said, well, you know what, I have not done anything that worked. Why don't we try that? So he came, and we spent over a third of a course just working on acting skills. Students learned, for the first part of their interfaith course, how it is that you ask open-ended questions to a stranger. They spent time reading sermons or other religious texts out loud to one another. And they had to improv act out interfaith scenes according to Barber's typology. So the students would imagine what conflict, independence, dialogue, and integration would be like if they were characters that were described in a sort of scene that was set out for them. And then the other students in the classroom would have to reflect on what it was that they had seen in a sort of fishbowl fashion. And it was immediately clear, to my sort of surprise, that this worked. There was something about the playfulness of this structure that opened them up to feel like they could communicate in a way that a traditional lecture or a sort of traditional set of analytic case studies did not. Now, I have been trying this for a while now because it was so bad at first and this was so much better. And I think at this point I've got sort of three major points that I sort of see coming out of what it is that students get from approaching things this way. So the first, right, is that for many students, interfaith dialogue is just terrifying. Getting taken up on an alien mothership, like at the end of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, probably seems preferable to most of them. And the stakes of asking someone else about their religion are very high for many students. And they're not really even sure how to ask an informed question. And as a non-scientist who has worked in theology and science, I can be pretty sympathetic. I didn't have the right credentials to be in the lab when I started working in theology and science. Equations made me break out into a cold sweat when they were being easily worked out by others. There were tons of words that I read and had no idea how to pronounce. And even when I was called on to speak them out loud, and I am still pretty convinced that statistics is just magic. And the same basic issues are terrifying to scientific scholars who have to show up in the humanities classroom. They don't have the right background in theology and science. Ontological speculation makes them break out in a cold sweat. There are words used on a regular basis with non-Latin characters, and we really do talk about magic. So, we don't talk about it in the academic world so much, but work in theology and science, particularly in the level of lay people, undergraduates, and faith communities, is premised on establishing rapport and trust that encourages people to ask open-ended questions and with a depth that helps them recognize an initial sense of mutual anxiety for the people around the table. So facilitating the development of that trust between people is a value that I see in theology and science at its best. We have always encouraged people to pursue this dialogue. Interfaith dialogue, likewise, can't proceed without developing those basic communication skills. Opening ourselves to being imaginative and restricting the rules of the everyday world through things like acting and play take the stakes out of those serious conversations so that they feel a little more manageable. And then we can feel free to make mistakes without offending someone else. After that, we can bring those things that we've learned back from the playful communication into the challenging realities of a higher stakes engagement. So, fear and trust. The second piece that I have sort of been working out is the idea that theology and science is inherently a public discourse. So thinking particularly of public theology, despite that this is maybe a fraught term for various religious traditions, and it may not appropriately apply to all religious traditions, I'd simply note that when I say public theology, I assume theology seeks to foster a wider societal set of goods that extend well beyond the confessional proclivities of any single community, and that those values contribute to the formation of public worldviews. So intuitively, my thinking about this has always been shaped by the moral and ethical reflection that I think is inherently part of a transdisciplinary aspect of theology and science dialogue. So whether you're talking about climate change and eco-theology, religious reflection on bioethics and transhumanism, questions of evolution and theodicy, those have been linked in my mind to thinking about the ways religion intersects with and shifts debates about wider civic public goods. The third thing, and I think this one is maybe the most important, is to do good theology and science dialogue, or good interfaith dialogue, requires understanding what anxieties threaten an ability to establish moods and motivation that open us up to others. So in particular, I have in mind the work of Soren Kierkegaard. More specifically, I like his word, shut-upness. It's actually a good translation. And for him, that's constituted by anxiety about the good. For Kierkegaard, the spirit, our ability rightly to be what we are intended to be before God, consistently reaches out to communicate in freedom. And with this freedom comes anxiety. So the argument is technical, but I'm going to try and do it really in a short way. So because freedom is for him the possibility of possibility, we live in anxiety over those possibilities not getting realized. We're anxious over not fulfilling the possibilities of our freedom. In the anxiety of shut-upness, though, this communication of freedom's cut off, and we lose some aspects of our sense of anxiety. So instead of affirming authentic freedom and all of its accompanying anxiety, we substitute an echo chamber of false surety that promises fulfillment if our unwavering dedication to only a single possibility or suite of possibilities gets maintained. So in shut-upness, we close ourselves off to the authentic breadth of our freedom. In short, in a shut-upness, we imagine we're freely living toward God because our anxiety seems to disappear. But in fact, what we actually do is get rid of that anxiety by accepting a certain slavishness, restricting the possibilities of our freedom, instead of accepting authentic freedom. I tried teaching that to the students once. It went over like a lead balloon. Hopefully it went over a little better in this crowd. But the trick with that definition of anxiety, those three sort of features, is that all too often, religion can turn into a sort of facilitator of a dogmatic approach that increases shut-upness instead of tamping it down. So a public theology shouldn't do this. Its aim is supposed to be just the opposite, to find and interpret the symbols from religious traditions that'll help prevent this turn to shutting people up, to provide us with symbols that remind us again and again to appreciate that we are not at the center of the world, that we must deeply care for the flourishing of others, and that we must care for the discovery of their authentic freedom. For me, in particular, this is what theology and science does. It works to promote the public discourse that draws people out of shut-upness. The methods and topologies that I learned here as a graduate student were the grist in the mill for helping my students think about how to prevent that sense of feeling, those irresolvable conflicts, the sense of an existential concern limited to themselves instead of to others. And it was a natural reaction to the sorts of theological texts that I was getting them to read. Because while academics are really great at analytical arguments, we are really terrible at explaining where those analytical arguments have come from. So two examples. as I was writing the second book that I wrote, which is a book on Christology, that no one can read. It's filled with dense philosophical, theological things for like 4 people to really understand, as good academic writing is supposed to do. But in the background of that text was a concern for what it meant for Jesus the Christ to be available to people who couldn't know Christ anymore. My mother has rapid onset dementia. What it meant for her to continue to be part of community in Christ is what motivated writing the book. I think about Bob, who despite all of the really technical language of time and eternity, is really thinking about what it means to see people in heaven again, in a way that's rational, in a way that makes sense. We don't tell those stories, and yet they're essential to what it is to help us open up out of this shut-upness. And I think that work in theology and science, when we do it at its best, makes us into public intellectuals. It gives us a responsibility for what theology and science is supposed to do, as it is a discipline that not only speaks internally to other scholars, but inculcates a set of intellectual values that are related to fostering forms of civic and interfaith dialogue that reach across difference. So, I've been thinking about this for a while, and I have 5 questions that I think motivate good religion and science work that is done in this vein, right? 5 questions that I hope religion and science scholars are asking. And that when we ask these 5 questions, that part of what ends up happening is that we foster a set of civic and public goods that facilitate things like interfaith dialogue, okay? So here's my first one, right? Where does my work invite others to name their anxiety? How is it giving others language in which to frame their experiences of anxiety? We have to listen closely to the concerns of others, and we need to seek to understand how people are framing their own experience of anxiety and how the possibilities of their own freedom create a sense of unrest in science, in theology, in the fields that they study. This creates a context of trust that lets people wrestle with these questions, questions of their own finitude, for a theological frame on it, and the risk of unfulfilled potentialities that they face, right? The second question is, do we portray dissenting points of view with empathy? Are we carefully and specifically naming where conflicts in the experience of anxiety arise? I think of this as a sort of exercise in deep listening, that we have to reteach the process of engaging others. So perhaps more than just civil dialogue, what I have in mind here is fostering an empathy by which we take seriously the existential concerns of another person, those concerns that limit their own sense of flourishing. Third, how do I encourage charitable exchange with dissenting interlocutors? Does my critique allow readers or students to dismiss those who do not share in a specific expression of anxiety? Or does my critique seek to persuade others of the importance of an ultimacy best addressed by a specific framing of anxiety? So a specific and really significant part of fostering dialogue is to resist the urge to immediately move to prophetic critique. What I mean is the sense to simply call someone else wrong. In a basic sense, this is really quite simply what folks like Dean Barber and others in theology and science dialogue have been advocating for decades. Listen to the other field. Assume that the concern is valid. It may not be your concern, but there's value in hearing it out. Fourth, are there places we seek to escape from the worldly anxiety of others by deeming them ultimately irrelevant? This is a fancy way of saying who gets excluded by the way we ask our questions. Theology and science often, at its worst, can be imagined as a sort of dogmatic defense of old positions that perhaps need to be rethought. Instead, what I would suggest is that theology and science done at its best is seeking to reinvent symbols from various religious and theological traditions in a way that opens them and makes them life-giving. Fifth, finally, how do I invite others to question what we give up, or should give up, as we support living with their feeling of anxiety? The honest end of good dialogue in religion and science is a willingness to set aside a supposition you began with. In the face of new evidence, might I let go of something I hold dear? What is that thing that I might let go? Good religion and science dialogue uses this as a premise in the way that it proceeds. You have to identify what is firm and what might change. But all too often that doesn't happen in other sorts of dialogue. So, if these sorts of questions are essential to doing theology and science, then I would argue that effective work in theology and science is by necessity inculcated in the process of a public theological imagining that, at least in an American context, has to grapple with civic pluralism. The intellectual values that theology and science dialogue inspires by encouraging this engagement across difference is immensely valuable, not just internally to specific confessional communities. In fact, it often leads those confessional communities to have to engage with others who do not agree with the positions that they initially take. In that spirit, I wanted to offer at least a tentative guide to what I think are 4 values that float between interfaith studies and theology and science that fit with these sorts of 5 questions. So these 4 values that I imagine are holy envy, holy humility, holy vulnerability, and unholy belonging. Okay? So holy envy, if you have done any work in interfaith dialogue or interfaith studies, you might recognize from Christopher Stendhal. It was part of one of his 3 rules of religious understanding. And the idea of this rule is that to talk to an adherent of another, well, the 3 rules go something like this. To talk to an adherent of another religious tradition, we have to assume we're not enemies. You do not compare your best to their worst, and you leave room for holy envy. And by holy envy, Stendhal meant that we have to recognize elements in another religious tradition that we wish could be part of our own. And because it opens up new dimensions or concepts in our own tradition or practice. With holy humility, I want to go one step further than Stendhal in a way that I think is important in terms of theology and science particularly. So theology and science dialogues make clear that these are truly different disciplines. Theology and science as distinct fields help us address different sets of concerns, and each can be enriched by understanding how the other field contributes to addressing a set of concerns that aren't well framed in either as a monodisciplinary pursuit. So with holy humility, what I want to encourage students to look for are the concerns that are not addressed within what they might claim to be their own religious tradition. So it's not only an envy for practices or concepts that can be borrowed and put into an existing framework. In this case, with humility, we have to admit that there might be concerns and religious truths that go beyond my tradition, that aren't addressed within my tradition, but may be present in the faith tradition of my neighbor. We have to have a deep appreciation for the distinctive ways that religions other than our own may speak to the existential questions that confront us, and an openness to recognize how other traditions that are not my own will better address some of those existential questions than my own tradition. Third, with holy vulnerability, I talk to students about the need to develop a critical awareness that interfaith work at its best is not merely about smoothing out tensions between propositional truths espoused by any set of faith traditions and dialogue. Interfaith engagement works on lived religious realities and practices of individuals and communities. It's powerful, meaning-laden territory that gets trod in this process. These are not dead ideas. So the work of interfaith dialogue, much like theology and science, is wrapped up with people's identities and commitments, their anxieties, and their hopes. To lay bare these critical parts of ourselves is to make our sense of the sacred vulnerable to the input of a religious other, and to, at the very least, bracket exclusivist claims to locate an emergent sense of truth that comes from my vulnerability, opening myself to thick relational natures of other persons' senses of religiosity and ultimate concern. That's the one that they really get stuck on. Nobody likes that one. Last, but not least, I have a sense of unholy belonging. This one sort of emerged for me in two senses. The first is that working with students who so often identify as having no religious preference, what I learned is that they actually have deep religious preferences. They have deep insights about a religious tradition that they do not want to claim that they belong to. They cannot be the standard bearer for all of the propositional truths of that belief tradition, so they assume one must hold those in order to call oneself a member of that religious tradition, and they can't be called that. So they're often interested in choosing to practice multiple religious traditions in a way that I want to suggest is not just simply syncretistic. So what I find is that these students are often choosing a sense of spiritual fluidity that doesn't fit well into the typical structures of how interfaith dialogue gets set up, which usually relies on first acknowledging, this is the position from which I come. I will talk with this person who is a religious other, wholly belonging to a single tradition. If we free ourselves from this requirement, I think we can do what Dwayne Bidwell has called participate in the generative imagination of spiritual fluidity, seeking out new ways to discover how the interaction of religious traditions promotes a commitment to human flourishing. In terms of religion and science, I find this one particularly important. As someone who was not a scientist, and maybe not even a theologian, right? Better than called a philosopher, right? Engaging in science and religion dialogue felt a little homeless. I didn't fit on that side of the scientific coin that one was supposed to fulfill and meet in order to be part of that dialogue. Right? It becomes a parallel in terms of how we think about what it means to belong to that set of discourses. Now, the other aspect of unholy belonging is that students, in particular, I have found, are really, really fearful of being perceived as bigoted or racist or otherwise exclusivist in such a sense that they would prefer not to discuss religious identity in any way at all, because they don't think they know about a religious tradition enough to speak as an expert. So the way around this, for us at least, has been to talk about interfaith dialogue as a place of speaking from one's own religious and existential concerns. You are never the arbiter of an entire particular religious tradition. In a similar way, in religion and science dialogue, I think this can be a freeing and inviting way to help people find their way of participating in religion and science dialogue when they may not consider themselves either deeply religious or well-equipped to discuss the science. So, encouraging the formation of values, I will admit, is not a recipe for quick political change. But I do think it encourages action and conversation in the face of systemic challenges that, in my experience, make undergraduates feel helpless. And perhaps, if it's of interest to you, we can talk about sort of the examples of where I imagine that going. Whether it's religion and science or interfaith studies, what I find is a fundamentally relational and dialogical set of disciplines that have a real opportunity, and I would argue maybe a real responsibility, to think about how it is that we constructively contribute to helping people develop the values and skills that get us past conflict and polarization. Thank you.
Appears to me that your pastoral sensitivities really have an ability to No, you're not, but you are demonstrating these sensitivities to the existential situation of your students that helps you to demonstrate in your teaching situation what you want to see in principle about the interreligious situation, which I'd like to be your student, have you as my professor.
It sounds better than it is, I trust me.
Okay, the floor is open. I'll play the role of MC, but who would like to either ask Adam a question, or perhaps what did this prompt in you that you feel needs saying? Fire away.
Okay, I was thinking of people being fearful, and the first thing that came up to is being fearful of being outed from one's in-group. So,
Yeah.
you go to your particular religious tradition and you're comfortable with it, and wait a minute, if we're going to integrate into something new, what is this something new? Am I going to get something greater than what I'm losing in my current tradition? And, well, before I'd talked about science and said, yes, scientists have a large fear of finding out that no, their tradition isn't the dominant tradition anymore, that they're going to have to, be fluid with scientific insights that somehow historically got shunted over into the religious traditions and not investigated in the current formal scientific tradition.
Well, I mean, to me, one of the biggest fears that I perceive when I'm engaged in religion and science dialogue, particularly with scientists, is the sheer fear of social ostracization that comes from speaking with religious persons, right? So finding a dialogue partner in the sciences, we have an interdisciplinary structure at Bethany, so we do a lot of team teaching. And so a lot of those courses end up with 2 faculty members in the classroom with students who are supposed to come from different disciplines. This was ostensibly why I was hired there, is that, naturally I seemed to be doing this. That was like what my degree was in. And it took me a while to find a science professor who would teach with me, right? Because it was, one, threatening. We don't know if this guy actually has the credentials in order to do the science that he's talking about doing. But also, two, right, it was a sense of outing. Who was going to be the science professor that was going to break down the wall of the hard sciences as the place on campus that did certain things by teaching across the hallway with the wacky religion guy who keeps showing up, right? So there's real sense of fear of social ostracization that's part of, not just with students, right, but it continues on, right? We could analyze this at a lot of different sort of sociological levels.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I am a scientist, and I'm on faculty in a university, and
I'm sorry, I like my science colleagues a lot.
So I announced at the faculty meeting that I was going off to the seminary. And yeah, there was a lot of that. And, so my question, I liked your slide that had the 5 questions. I think that really answered a lot of things for me.
Oh,
really. So I come back, I'm on sabbatical, right, to get an MDiv. And when I fly back in, I run a laboratory, and I run into people. They tend to try to avoid me at this point, and because I'm sure they don't know what to do. And I'm wondering, how do we kind of open up that dialogue again to say, hey, I'm really okay. This is really okay. This is not as scary as it looks.
Right. So there's no easy answer to that question, nor will I try to pontificate that I have found the brilliant solution by which to do this. What I will say is that I'll think about 3 different sort of features of this, right? So the first one is that I think being a known quantity is helpful, right? This is someone who I trust. Yes, they went away for sabbatical for a year, but I'm still the same person who's coming back into this department. It's not like I've suddenly lost my ability to do my professional work by engaging this other set of questions, right? And a certain persistence is part 2, right, of saying that over and over. Wears down people. I mean that in the best possible sense. what I mean is that, I'll frame it in a more positive way. The repetition of continuing to show and model that this is an effective disposition that's actually more beneficial than what has traditionally been in place maybe as a culture within a department, I think can be really helpful. Again, it's a long game. And then the third insight is actually not mine, but is a colleague. So I do a podcast. You're welcome to take a little card for it. Because I got super excited. This is not true. I got asked to do this, and I really thought what I was signing on for was something that was not going to have any legs. Recording this and other people will be hearing it. Right? I said I would do it because I thought like we do 5 or 6 episodes, it'd be kind of fun, and then it would just sort of fizzle out. It didn't. And so now I'm doing it a lot. But one of the really interesting things is it's a sort of set of questions of both pastors and academics who are working on issues in religion and science from interfaith perspectives. So one of our contributors is a science educator, and he has spoken, I think, really brilliantly and really eloquently about the experience of opening up about the ways that faith was really important to him, while also being deeply committed to principles of science education. He was on faculty at LSU when the cases about teaching evolution in the public schools were going through the Louisiana Supreme Court. He ended up testifying in those cases on behalf of teaching evolution, right? And so he has been one of the best people that I have heard sort of reflect about what the challenges of that are, particularly from the sciences. I'm hesitant to sort of say like how that works because I'm not a scientist, right? And so the sort of way in which I generate fears or anxieties would be quite different. But I think having more forums and instances where folks can talk about those differences, right? That coming from a particular side of this dialogue, or not from one of those positions into the dialogue, creates different sets of anxieties for people. And it would be interesting to have someone schematize that out. Not me, that's a graduate student who should be doing that project.
Well, did you finally develop a rapport with your scientific colleagues?
Well, I've known them for years and years. I think this kind of, I'm not sure why it came as such a shock that I would go off and finally actually finish, doing this forever. But I have to tell you one other thing. So I go running and I have my CDSP, sweatshirt on. And I run into 2 scientists. You could tell they're scientists a million miles away. So I'm thinking, oh, my scientists. I run up to them and I say, hi, I bet you're scientists, or something corny like that. They panicked. I think they thought, what is she? They were scientists. They actually worked. They were on health. And I think they panicked. And I thought, I think it's a sweatshirt. I told them, I'm okay. I'm a scientist. It's okay. And it's a funny experience. I'm still not sure how to navigate it.
Right.
Yeah, but I'm working on it.
Go ahead.
Okay, I was thinking about, well, the scientists, they need to earn a living, which means they need to get grants. And so, this is fair. Hey, if my science is going to include some theological thing, then all I'm going to be able to get grants from is the Templeton Foundation. And of course, it's a long cycle, and it's only one foundation. And I might really be hard up. Cast out of the hard science community.
There's real economic pressures that are part of this story that I did not include here tonight. And I will say, those are real economic pressures that I think are really different in a university context than in a small liberal arts college context, right? So here's a place where I think actually the university college structure matters deeply to sort of how that plays itself out. But yes, those are real pressures that people face. There are real consequences, and when I do this with students, I try to indicate there are real consequences to the way that you do this and how people will perceive you. You need to be aware of that as part of what goes on.
I don't know if this is something that, would happen at the undergraduate level, given what you were talking about your students having trouble grasping certain things or being able to articulate things in a certain way. But given the fact that you've paralleled science, religion dialogue with interfaith dialogue, do you think it's helpful to either process or both processes to frame things just simply as different traditions of knowledge, in the sense that, whether it's Christian, let's say Protestant theology, quantum physics, Islamic law, and then sort of like a Malcolm Gladwell, it takes 10,000 hours in each of them to even kind of really become competent. And so just as an undergraduate has to pick, like, I'm not going to be an anthropologist or a historian or a physicist, that these things, whether you believe in them or not, whether you find them illuminating in your personal life or in your apprehension of the world outside your own brain, is a separate question. But on one level, they're just books, and they're just bibliographies. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or do you think that that's unhelpful? Because, and is that maybe too also something that makes religious people uncomfortable? It's just a bunch of books.
I hadn't thought about it that way. So undergrads, boy, so much fun. Because I just infinitely predict incorrectly how they are going to respond to what it is that I'm going to do. So I'm going to give an answer that I'm pretty sure if I test out will be wrong, but that's okay. So I generally stay away from just presenting them as sort of different intellectual traditions. And I'm going to back off that statement here in a second. Okay. I do it for two reasons. One is that I want them to think about intellectual traditions in a more embodied way, a series of practices. And when I present it as intellectual traditions, it suddenly becomes about propositional sets of knowledge. And a lot of those anxieties suddenly sort of creep up on them. I'm not expert enough, I haven't done my 10,000 hours, I shouldn't be the one who's doing this, right? So I stay away from it for that reason. The other piece here is more of a sort of like back and forth, right? Which is to say, a lot of times I will introduce this in specific contexts, like with a theology and science method and a very specific sort of example, or with a case study that we're going to act out in the classroom as particular participants in some sort of interfaith conflict, right? And then we'll back away from that and say, hey, don't these look like basic ways of communicating with other people across other sorts of conflict that you can imagine? Why don't you tell me what conflict you think is important, which generally comes from some sort of field that they're interested in? Then we sort of work our way back into the specifics. Why didn't it work as well as you wanted? What was it that you specifically needed to know from that field or from that more specific area of study that would have made this dialogue richer and sharper? Okay, now let's take a step back again. Now I see there are these basic skills in dialogue that work in a variety of different contexts. I can use it for different intellectual traditions. But also, I need to know something about those intellectual traditions in order to make it specific enough that it doesn't just feel general and vague the whole time, right? Now, I mean, we can do that in a paragraph. I think the trick with undergraduates, right, is you need about 4 weeks to do that. If you really want the point to sort of sink in. Because it needs to be experienced and practiced and then reflected upon and then reimagined and reinvigorated and sort of put back in a second time, then moved forward a step, right? It's that the process of doing that is much slower, right? To me, that's been the big experience of what I have continually been surprised by too. In a graduate student setting, I could probably do that in a day and do it really thoroughly. In an undergraduate setting, you can't. And so how it is that you want to adapt for those different time frames of introducing these dialogical skills is, I think, really important.
Do you find that that students, maybe with little religious tradition, are as engaged in the process and the questioning and the acting as the ones who maybe, been to church every Sunday and,
Yeah, actually, I find that they're more willing to play along. I think there's less at stake. And so here I'll give a sort of specific example, right? So we have a couple of folks who teach yoga. Everybody has folks that teach yoga now. And one of them is actually a religion professor on campus who went and is now trained as a yoga instructor because he was very afraid of sort of the syncretism of doing this. But also, if we want to teach anything about bodily experiential practice of Hinduism, we sort of have to take the risk of syncretism. It's just inherently in the challenge of doing this when you're in a very sort of monocultural community. Inevitably, when I sort of do some of these more integrative activities with students, I will tell them if you are uncomfortable, you can always opt out of doing this. That is okay, we'll talk about it, we'll find another way for you to participate in the class. I will not force you to do it. Most students are totally game. It is the generally most committed Christian students who are deeply uncomfortable with the idea of playing another faith tradition role. Whether it's a sort of acting event or whether it's asking them to participate in yoga, almost without fail has been my experience. And I think that gets back to this sort of question of anxiety and where those anxieties emerge in these encounters. I think it can be really productive. But I was surprised. I sort of assumed that it would be the students who were least interested in being there who would sort of bucket doing this. And it was oftentimes students who were most excited about the course initially who are now deeply suspicious of what it is that I would ask them to do from here on out. I will say too, the nice part, I sort of painted a bleak picture of what it is that I do with my ability in theology and science, right? But the nice part is I write more letters for medical school than I do for seminary.
You write what?
More letters of recommendation for medical school than I do for seminary. I think one of the really interesting things of doing this sort of interdisciplinary work, doing these sorts of interfaith dialogue events, is that you become, your department becomes known as this place on campus where I can go and ask these questions safely. Also, I'm deeply, deeply committed to selling my program, and so I just generally don't let students leave until they've signed up for it once they come in the door. It's a combination of both. But suddenly a student takes a course, they do some of these things in it, they realize, aha, this guy is not what I thought religion was, this set of propositional beliefs, and now I would like to have more conversations with them. And so the result has been, despite the fact that I don't teach theology and science that much, on average, if I went back, I could look and pull the numbers for sure, but I'm willing to bet that about half of our graduates in the past 5 years have been double majors in biology and religion, most of whom looking to go on into some sort of allied health field. Makes me feel good about who my doctor might be one day.
I was thinking about going back to Plato and the original abstract Trinity, which eventually became anthropomorphized into the Christian Trinity. And the third element there is the forms, which we describe with mathematics. And there's a large fear when mathematics comes out because very few people understand abstract mathematics, and they end up just being, fearful of getting into this because of being lost.
Well, abstract mathematics is usually you have to have a couple of years of it to graduate to get into college, or at least graduate from high school.
Yeah, they don't really teach abstract mathematics until upper division, undergraduate. Very few people, 1 in several hundred people.
What do you mean by abstract mathematics? Anything beyond arithmetic or what?
Anything past linear algebra. So Newton got differential equations, you learn that. You get up to vectors and matrices, and that's for engineering. Anything beyond that, the next thing goes to abstract algebra, where you essentially develop math from basic axioms and rules and how to do that. I'm saying only a few, one in a few hundred people actually get very far into that. And yet, when you go down to what's the nature of reality, you have to get into it. You can't just get stuck, stay at the engineering math level.
Do you believe, as some mathematicians do, that, and I'm talking about abstract mathematics now, that those numbers are actually real in the Platonic form sense of being real? I think a lot of mathematicians do, don't they?
Yeah, that's I've asked mathematicians about, are you a Platonist or Aristotelian? And actually I get a mixed answer.
Yeah.
Aristotelianism essentially is where science has gone, empiricism would be the general word. But once you go into, reality is determined by mathematics, and the only way you can understand it is all of reality is determined by all of mathematics in some very networking way. Whoa, that's not the way things are taught in academia, which means you take a real tunnel vision of some very small piece of reality and you get your 100 people in the world to just focus on that.
Well, I'll say this, I have not taught with the math professor yet. We're teaching in the fall, so I'll let you know how it goes. If it's just truly doubly terrifying to the students. We put it on the plate for the honors students specifically to maybe ward off some of the fear. I'm not sure it's working. They've already come to talk to me a little bit about what it is that we're asking them to do. But I mean, I think this is an interesting question, right, in terms of where those fears arise when you do interdisciplinary dialogue, particularly for students who don't feel like they're well-versed, right, in at least one of the fields. And my experience has been that for the most part, students tend to be more afraid of the stuff that I'm usually doing in those interdisciplinary dialogues, the sort of religion theology side, because of these social issues. When we get into the midst of that and they realize that, oh, I can't talk about them, then they get really scared of the other aspect of the dialogue, right, particularly math and science, where they go, oh man, I did not know nearly as much as I thought I did when I walked into this place, both of which I think are actually really fruitful and generative experiences. The trick is framing them as fruitful and generative experiences when that occurs. So I'll be real curious to see when we do a sort of pure math and religion course to sort of try this out and see how it goes.
Well, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton all believe that God thinks in mathematics. So when God created the world, and the scientists interpret the world, the scientists are telling us the mind of God. So you don't have a theologian and a non-theologian, you have two theologians teaching that.
In fact, the math professor I'm teaching with made something like that argument when we were working on the course. She was like, really? I don't know if this counts. So hey, good for you.
Right?
That's okay. I'm going to talk about robots, so we'll make sure that we get
So you talked about, interdisciplinary teaching, and you talked about, facilitating, interfaith dialogue and with the students. But do you teach like a Christian theology course or history of Christianity course or something that's like more traditional?
Oh, I do.
And do these things come up at all in those contexts, or in that context, are people like, okay, I'm comfortable, I know theology, I know history, I know what Christianity is, like, or is this is totally two very different things?
They're not for me. I would argue that, in large part, when you do your training in an interdisciplinary area or an interfaith area, all of the teaching that you start doing after that bleeds into that framework, right? So part of it is that I'll intentionally look for where those interdisciplinary interfaith books are in the typical historical seminar that the student wants. So that's sort of one way that I think about what that looks like. I would also argue that after you start doing that with students, and sort of one of the benefits of doing this in small community contexts is that you become a known quantity, right? Oh, you're gonna have a course with Pryor, it's gonna go like this, right? And so it becomes a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy in a certain sense when the student shows up into the room to know what to expect out of that interfaith, interdisciplinary sort of element. The piece that I was a little light on in the presentation tonight, but is also a big emphasis for me out of this, is how do you shift some of those dialogical skills into civic action and advocacy. Big piece of what I sort of stress with the students more in a traditional seminar setting is that the things that we're talking about here stay in the classroom, then I didn't do my job very well. You need to be able to think about how it is that this is going to be useful to you and work forward into your advocating on behalf of these other folks who we have talked about as part of this course. That is its own related but interesting set of challenges in terms of thinking through those moments of engagement. So my colleague and I at the college right now are working on a grant project where what we're really doing are gathering resources for how in rural contexts do you teach students about skills in civic engagement. So that when they learn these skills in dialogue that I've sort of been focusing on in terms of religious, interfaith, interdisciplinary, science and religion sorts of questions, how now do I take that and create social change out of it? It's one thing for them to be able to lead a conversation with a friendly room full of people. It's another, Kansas, right? It's another to show up in the office of a state House of Representative member who's a climate change denier, and figure out how it is that you want to tweak these skills that you've learned into this context in order to actively advocate on some of the knowledge that you've learned. So for me, that's sort of the next step that comes out of this in terms of thinking about what it should do.
Well, Adam, we're about to finish up. Do you have any last words?
I get the last word.
You get the
It's
omega.
dangerous.
You get the omega.
No, I don't have last words. This has been a ton of fun. Thank you for coming this evening amidst all of the, I know there are always 18 million things that you could be doing in the Bay Area on any given night. So I appreciate you coming up.
So Saturday, if you're interested in head knocking from 1 o'clock until 5 o'clock, Adam is going to tell the astrobiologists what they ought to be doing. No, I overstated the case. What are the implications of astrobiology and the search for life's origin for understanding God? Humanity is Imago Dei and
the Imago Dei, sin and vocation.
Imago Dei, sin and vocation. So that's Saturday. Well, let's give Adam our